Clara had always been the kind of woman who blended into the background. At 42 years old, her life revolved around routine. She woke early, brewed a single cup of coffee, and walked the quiet path to the small library where she worked. Her days were filled with the hum of fluorescent lights, the faint smell of old paper, and the soft sounds of pages turning. People who visited the library rarely noticed her, except when she checked out their books or directed them to a shelf. For years she convinced herself this life was enough, but loneliness has a way of creeping in slowly, quietly, until one day it becomes impossible to ignore. Clara began to feel the weight of it pressing against her chest each night as she sat alone in her modest apartment. She had never married, though she had come close, once in her late 20s. That relationship dissolved quickly, leaving her cautious and mistrusting. Since then, her life had become a cycle of work, reading, and solitary evenings. The world outside seemed to move quickly. Friends got married, raised children, traveled, and filled their social media pages with pictures of smiling faces. Clara remained in the same place, stuck in the same rhythm. The silence of her home became unbearable, so she started looking for connection elsewhere. It began innocently. She signed up for an online forum about literature, where people from around the world discussed their favorite novels. She never expected to find anything more than book recommendations. But one evening she noticed a user who always seemed to reply to her posts. His username was Michael42. His comments were kind, thoughtful, and always made her feel noticed in a way she hadn't felt in years. Soon their conversations drifted away from books and into personal lives. Clara discovered that Michael claimed to be around her age, a widower living in another city. He wrote about how lonely he felt after losing his wife, and how he admired Clara's gentle way of looking at the world. Every day after work, Clara rushed home to check her messages. Her routine changed, and for the first time in a long time, she felt excitement in her chest. Michael's words were careful and sweet, as if he knew exactly what she needed to hear. He told her she was special, that he liked her honesty, that she was different from the shallow people he met online. These small affirmations fed her in a way nothing else had. Weeks turned into months, and soon Clara was spending hours each night on her computer, pouring her thoughts into long paragraphs she never thought she would share with anyone. For the first time in years, she felt alive. She smiled more at work, humming quietly as she shelved books. Her colleagues noticed the change but didn't ask questions. They assumed she had found some new hobby, or perhaps reconnected with old friends. Clara kept Michael a secret, fearing that others might not understand. But in her heart, she believed she had found something rare, something real. She began to imagine what it would be like to see him in person, to hear his voice without the distance of a screen. Michael started to suggest the same idea. At first he hinted gently, asking what she thought about meeting someday. Then his messages became more direct. He told her he wanted to hold her hand, to see the woman who had changed his life, to no longer hide behind text on a screen. Clara hesitated. The thought of meeting a man she had only known online made her nervous, yet the longing inside her was stronger. She convinced herself that he was genuine, that he cared about her as much as she cared about him. One evening he sent her an address and told her he would be waiting. Clara stared at it for a long time, her heart pounding. She thought about every warning she had ever heard about strangers online, every news story about scams and dangers. But Michael had become her confidant, the one person who seemed to truly understand her. After weeks of indecision, she made her choice. She would go. Clara prepared carefully for the trip. She bought a new dress, light blue with small flowers along the hem, something that made her feel softer, more feminine. She packed her suitcase neatly, slipping in her favorite perfume, and a saul-wrapped gift for Michael, a book of poems she thought he would like. She told her colleagues at the library that she was taking a short vacation, but she didn't share the details. It felt too personal, too fragile to explain. The night before her departure, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind filled with images of what the meeting might be like. She pictured a warm smile, a gentle embrace, Maybe even the beginning of a love story she thought had passed her by. For once, her loneliness didn't feel permanent. For once, she believed her life could change. When the morning came, she stepped onto the train with her suitcase in hand, her heart racing with anticipation. The city she was traveling to felt like a promise of something new, something better. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the train window and watched the landscape blur past, holding tightly to the hope that she had finally found the happiness she had been searching for. Clara's journey began on a crisp morning, the kind of day where the air carried both excitement and unease. She held her suitcase tightly as she boarded the train, her fingers trembling as though they already sensed what her heart refused to admit. The train hummed steadily along the tracks, fields blurring into forests, forests fading into towns, each mile carrying her farther from the safety of her routine and deeper into the unknown. She tried to distract herself by flipping through a book, but her eyes refused to stay on the words. Her mind was too busy imagining the moment she would finally see Michael face to face. Every message he had sent played back in her head, wrapping her in the illusion of comfort. She pictured him smiling at her from the platform, waving like an old friend she had known her whole life. As the train slowed into the station, a pang of nervousness twisted inside her. She stepped down with her suitcase and looked around. The city was not quite what she expected. She had imagined crowds, cafes, and the constant chatter of people, but what she saw instead was eerily quiet. The streets seemed half empty, the buildings plain and unwelcoming. Following the directions Michael had given her, she walked past narrow alleys and long rows of houses with peeling paint. There were no flowers in the windows, no children playing outside, just the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the stillness. A sense of unease brushed against her thoughts, but she forced herself to ignore it. This was only her anxiety, she told herself. She had dreamed of this meeting for months. She could not let nerves ruin it now. She carried the small gift she had bought for him, a book of poems tied with a ribbon, and held it close to her chest. She imagined him touched by the gesture, grateful for her kindness. The farther she walked, however, the more unsettling the surroundings became. Some houses were abandoned, their windows boarded up. Others had doors that hung crooked on rusty hinges. The neighborhood felt deserted, and yet she had the sense of being watched. She glanced behind her a few times, but the streets stretched out empty. The only sound was the faint rustle of wind through broken fences. At last, she reached the address Michael had given her. The house stood at the end of the street, its paint faded to a dull gray, the garden overgrown with weeds. Something about it looked wrong, but she told herself it didn't matter. Maybe he lived humbly. Maybe he simply didn't care about appearances. She stepped up to the door, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. She expected to see the kind, warm man she had pictured for months. She knocked softly, clutching the gift in her hands. The door creaked open, and Clara froze. The man who appeared in the doorway was not Michael. At least, not the man she had imagined. His face was harder, his expression cold and calculating. He was older than he had claimed, with sharp lines etched into his features and eyes that carried no warmth at all. His presence filled the doorway like a wall she could not move past. For a fleeting second she wondered if she had made a mistake, if perhaps Michael had sent her to the wrong address. But the man spoke her name, and in that moment, every doubt vanished. This was the person behind the screen, the one who had written her tender words, who had promised her affection. Everything she thought she knew about him shattered instantly. Clara's stomach dropped as she realized the truth. The man standing in front of her was a stranger, and yet he knew her, had studied her, had lured her here. She felt her throat tighten as fear pressed down on her chest, but before she could think of turning back, he moved aside and gestured for her to come in. There was something in the way he stood, something in his silence that made refusal impossible. Against every instinct, she stepped forward into the darkness of his home. The door closed behind her with a sound that seemed to seal her fate. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and stale dust. The curtains were drawn tight, letting in almost no light. Furniture was scattered without care, and the walls bore stains she couldn't identify. Her chest tightened further with each breath she took. She wanted to believe she was wrong, that maybe this was simply not what she had expected. But deep down she already knew she had made a terrible mistake. Every message, every sweet word he had ever written to her, now echoed like a cruel trick inside her mind. The man who had comforted her loneliness was nothing more than a mask. What stood in front of her now was the reality behind that mask, something dangerous, something predatory, something that made her wish she had never answered his first message. The dream she had carried with her on the train dissolved into dread, and Clara realized she was trapped in a situation she no longer understood, with no clear way to escape. The house swallowed Clara whole. The moment the door shut behind her, the air was damp and thick, and the faint creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder than it should. She clutched her suitcase and the small gift she had carried for him, her fingers tightening around it as though it could anchor her to the hope she had clung to for months. But even as she tried to steady her breathing, the truth pressed down hard. This was not the man she thought she had known. The walls around her were lined with peeling wallpaper. The smell of mildew clung to every surface, and the silence of the house felt alive, almost as if it were waiting for something. The man moved ahead of her, with slow, heavy steps, his shoulders hunched forward, his frame broad but tired-looking. He didn't glance back at her, didn't offer the warmth she had been promised. Instead, he carried an air of control, as though everything that was happening was already part of a plan he had rehearsed. Clara's heart beat unevenly, and though her instinct screamed to turn around and leave, her feet carried her deeper inside, drawn forward by the unspoken command in his presence. The living room was worse than she expected. A sagging couch sat in the corner, littered with unwashed blankets. Empty bottles stood on the floor like forgotten soldiers. There was no sign of the gentle man who had told her about his supposed love for poetry, no trace of the widower who had poured out his grief to her over countless late-night conversations. Instead, what she saw made her stomach twist. This was not a place built for sharing, for healing, or for romance. It was a trap. She set her suitcase down slowly, her hands shaking. The gift she had wrapped so carefully in ribbon now looked pitiful in her grasp. Absurd in the dim, heavy air of this place. She placed it on the nearest table, as if clinging to the hope that he would see it, open it, and reveal that she had been wrong. That there was still a piece of the man she had come for, buried beneath this stranger's cold exterior. But the man didn't notice. His eyes seemed to skim over everything but her, as if the only thing alive in the room was Clara herself. A shiver crawled across her skin. Every word he had ever written now replayed in her mind, but twisted and hollow. She remembered the nights she had sat up in bed, smiling at her computer screen, her heart swelling with the idea that someone out there finally cared for her. She had told him things she had never told anyone about her disappointments, her loneliness, her fear of growing old alone. She had handed him her vulnerabilities, thinking they were safe in his hand. Now she realized he had been collecting them, cataloging them, and shaping himself into exactly what she wanted to believe. It had never been love, it had been strategy. The weight of betrayal pressed down harder than the fear. She wanted to scream at herself for being so foolish, for ignoring the unease that had pricked at her ever since she stepped off the train. Every red flag she had dismissed now burned vividly in her memory. The empty streets, the boarded houses, the silence that had greeted her as she walked to his door. It had all been pointing to this. She had walked willingly into a place she should never have come near. The man finally turned to face her, and in his stare she read everything she needed to know. There was no kindness in it, no recognition of the connection she had thought they shared. His eyes were dark, flat, and unreadable, and yet they made her feel stripped bare. He stepped closer, and though she wanted to move back, her body froze. It was as if her fear had turned her into stone, unable to retreat, unable to flee. The sound of his footsteps against the warped floorboards filled the silence, growing louder with each step, until he was standing close enough for her to smell the sourness of his breath. Clara's mind raced, searching for explanations, for excuses, for some kind of sense. Maybe he had lied about his age. Maybe the photos he had used were old. Maybe grief had made him retreat into this life of decay and neglect. But deep down, she knew better. This was not a man broken by love. This was a man who had constructed an illusion, who had studied her loneliness and fed it back to her until she believed. She realized then that she had not been chosen because she was special or different. She had been chosen because she was vulnerable, because she was exactly the kind of woman who would believe. The gift she had brought, her final token of trust, sat unopened on the table, a cruel reminder of how far she had fallen into his trap. She wanted to grab it, to hold it close, to reclaim even a small piece of the dignity she had lost. But her arms felt heavy, and the man's shadow loomed over her. The hope she had carried for months drained out of her, replaced with a sinking certainty that she was no longer in control of what would happen next. In the hollow silence of that house, Clara's dream of love finally shattered. What she had thought was the beginning of something beautiful had revealed itself as the edge of a nightmare, and though she had not yet seen the full extent of what awaited her, she already knew she was trapped inside the twisted reality of a man who had never been Michael at all. The hours dragged inside the house, stretching into an endless blur that seemed designed to break Clara's spirit. The air felt heavier the longer she stayed, as if the walls were pressing in on her. She kept her hands folded in her lap, sitting rigidly on the edge of the stained couch, afraid to move, afraid to speak. Every sound in the house carried a weight that made her flinch: the creak of a floorboard upstairs, the faint hum of a refrigerator, even the man's steady breathing as he moved through the rooms. Time no longer felt real. It was impossible to tell whether it was day or night outside, since the curtains were drawn tight and not a sliver of light broke through. Her mind raced with escape routes, but each possibility ended before it began. The door was bolted from the inside, and the windows she had quietly examined earlier were nailed shut with thick planks of wood. The thought of screaming entered her mind more than once, but the streets outside had been deserted when she arrived. Who would hear her? Who would even bother to come? The silence of the neighborhood echoed in her memory, reminding her how truly isolated she was. She tried to think of small details, anything that might keep her focused. The faint ticking of a clock in another room gave her something to count. The weight of her suitcase, still sitting where she had dropped it near the door, reminded her she had once entered this place with hope. She clung to those small things because the alternative was drowning in the reality of what she had stepped into. The man seemed to enjoy her fear. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew she had nowhere to go. Each time he walked past her, she felt the air shift, like a predator circling prey. She kept her eyes down, though every part of her wanted to watch him, to know where he was at every moment. Looking at him too long, however, felt dangerous, as though acknowledging him gave him even more power. Hours passed, and exhaustion gnawed at her body. Her head ached from tension, her throat was dry, and her legs burned from sitting so stiffly. She longed to lie down, to rest, but she dared not let herself grow comfortable. If she lowered her guard, she feared she would never wake. Instead, she waited, searching for patterns in his movements, watching for moments when his guard slipped. It wasn't until late in the night that the chance came. She had nearly given up hope when she heard the sound of heavy breathing from across the room. The man had slumped into a worn armchair, his body sinking into the cushions. His head tilted back, and his chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of sleep. For several minutes Clara did not move, terrified it was a trick. She kept her breathing shallow, her hands clenched into fists against her knees. When she finally dared to lift her head, her eyes fell on the table beside the chair. There, glinting faintly in the dim light, lay a set of keys. Her pulse quickened, each beat like a hammer against her ribs. She waited longer, counting the man's breaths, listening to the weight of his sleep. Then, with painstaking care, she shifted her body forward. Every creak of the couch felt like a thunderclap in the silence, but he did not stir. She rose to her feet slowly, her knees trembling beneath her weight. Each step toward the keys felt endless, her body balanced between hope and terror. When she reached the table, her hand hovered above the keys, shaking so violently she was afraid she might drop them. Her fingers finally closed around the cold metal, and she pulled them close to her chest. For the first time since stepping into the house, she felt the faint stirrings of control, but she knew she wasn't safe yet. The door was still bolted, and one wrong sound could undo everything. She crept across the room, the keys pressed tightly in her hand. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her ears straining for any change in his breathing. The suitcase by the door was a temptation, but she dared not touch it. The sound of the zipper or the scrape of its wheels could wake him. She focused only on the lock. Her hands trembled as she fit the key into the door, twisting it as slowly as possible. The metal clicked faintly, a sound that made her heart stop, but still the man did not move. When the final bolt slid free, Clara pulled the door open, just enough to slip through. The night air hit her face like a wave, cool and sharp against her skin. She wanted to run, but she forced herself to walk silently until she was several steps from the house. Then, with adrenaline rushing through her veins, she broke into a sprint. The street stretched endlessly before her, her bare feet slapping against the pavement, her breath ragged with desperation. Behind her, the house loomed like a shadow, but she did not look back. She couldn't. Every ounce of her strength went into moving forward, into escaping the nightmare she had willingly walked into. In the distance she spotted the glow of lights, a gas station, standing like a beacon of safety against the darkness. And for the first time since her journey began, Clara felt a fragile thread of hope pulling her towards salvation. Clara's lungs burned as she ran, but the glowing lights of the gas station drew her forward like a promise she refused to let slip away. She stumbled onto the cracked pavement of the lot, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The night worker behind the counter froze when he saw her disheveled, pale and barefoot, her clothes clinging to her damp skin. She could barely form words as she pressed her hands against the glass and begged for help. Within minutes the phone was in his hand and the police were on their way. Clara collapsed onto a bench outside, her chest heaving, her hands still clutching the set of keys she had stolen. When the flashing lights appeared on the horizon, she felt the first stirrings of safety. The officers guided her gently inside their car, offering blankets and water, while she struggled to steady her voice enough to tell them what had happened. Every detail tumbled out in fragments. How she had met him online, the address he had given her, the house where he was waiting. They didn't question her desperation, they could see it etched into her every movement. Without wasting time, they sped toward the street Clara had escaped from, ready to confront the man who had trapped her. At the house, silence still clung to the street. The front door was ajar, swinging faintly in the breeze, the locks broken by Clara's escape. When the officers stepped inside, they found the man awake and furious, pacing like an animal that had just realized its prey had slipped away. He tried to deny everything, but the evidence was too strong. On his computer, they uncovered a web of false identities, profiles on multiple platforms, each one crafted to lure in lonely women like Clara. There were folders filled with stolen photographs, carefully selected to create the illusion of a caring, trustworthy man. There were message logs stretching back years, each conversation carefully tailored to the hopes and fears of his victims. But what chilled investigators most was the discovery of personal items scattered throughout the house. A scarf tucked in a drawer, a necklace on the floor of a closet, an unopened box of chocolates hidden behind the couch. Each object was tied to a different woman, tokens of those who had believed his lies and fallen into his trap. Clara was not the first to walk through his door, but she was the first to make it out alive. Back at the station, Clara sat wrapped in a blanket, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The shock had left her drained, her mind caught between relief and disbelief. She kept replaying the past months in her head, searching for the signs she had missed, the warnings she had ignored. Every kind word, every tender message had been nothing more than bait, designed to disarm her and feed her hope. The realization cut deeper than she expected. It wasn't just the danger she had escaped, but the betrayal of believing she had finally found love, only to learn it had all been a lie. The story quickly spread beyond the small town. News outlets reported on the case, framing it as a chilling example of the hidden dangers of online relationships. People were shocked by the details, the extent of his manipulation, and the number of women he had targeted. Some shared sympathy for Clara, admiring her courage in escaping. Others whispered cruelly about her naivety, unable to understand the depth of loneliness that could lead someone to trust a stranger so completely. Clara avoided the headlines, but she knew her story had become a warning to countless others. The man was eventually charged with multiple crimes, the evidence too vast for him to deny. His past victims began to come forward, each one recounting a similar story of promises, lies, and fear. Some had managed to walk away before it was too late, while others had been trapped and silenced. The courtroom became a stage for their voices, and Clara sat among them, her presence a reminder of what could have been lost. Despite the justice being served, Clara struggled to rebuild her life. The library, once a place of quiet comfort, now felt empty and unfamiliar. She avoided the computer for weeks, terrified of seeing another message, another name pretending to be something it wasn't. Nights were the hardest. Sleep often slipped away, replaced by vivid memories of the locked windows and the suffocating silence of the house. Yet even in the shadows of fear, she clung to the fact that she had survived. What kept her going was the knowledge that her story might prevent others from falling into the same trap. The police encouraged her to speak to local groups about online safety, and though her voice trembled the first time she stood before a room of strangers, she found strength in their listening faces. Each time she told her story, the weight of it grew a little lighter. She became a symbol of resilience, her survival a testament to the power of courage even in the darkest moments. Clara would never forget the house, the man, or the months of lies that had led her there. But she refused to let them define her. She had walked into the nightmare believing in love, and she had walked out believing in her own strength. Though the scars would remain, she carried them with quiet defiance, a living warning that sometimes danger wears the mask of kindness, and sometimes survival begins the moment you choose to run.